Good morning, everyone. All right, I am Jonathan Bowles, the Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future. Thank you so much for being here today. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being in town in New York City at the end of August. Thanks for coming to a wonky policy forum at the end of August. Also, thanks to everybody joining us on the live stream. We actually have about 260 people that have registered to watch this on the live stream, so appreciate you all doing so. I'd like to thank the Human Services Council, Michelle Jackson and all of her team. You'll be hearing from Michelle a little bit later, but it's been really great to co-sponsor with them today. Also, a big thank you to Ponce Bank for supporting this event and making today's discussion possible. The Center for an Urban Future is an independent think tank dedicated to expanding economic opportunity in New York City. In recent months, our work has advanced concrete ideas for how New York City can help create a more equitable economy. We've written about the need to scale up the city's most effective tech training programs, shown why it's so important to extend the state's tuition assistance program to part-time CUNY students, urged city government to boost support for entrepreneurs living in public housing, and made the case for new programs to help the roughly 700,000 adults in the city who have some college credits but no degree to reconnect with CUNY and complete their credential. We also know, however, that creating a more equitable city won't be possible without strengthening the city's human services nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits in every corner of the city serve as the safety net of last resort for hundreds of thousands of struggling New Yorkers. And they play an indispensable role in boosting the most vulnerable New Yorkers, strengthening communities, and helping individuals catapult into the middle class. Their role and their impact has only grown during these past 2 difficult years. But our research at the Center for an Urban Future and that of organizations like HSC has made it clear that too many of these nonprofits are financially vulnerable themselves, and their fiscal problems have been compounded by city and state government. City officials have recently taken important steps to clear the backlog of government contracts for services provided by nonprofits and ensure on-time payments. But there are other ways that New York policymakers can help strengthen and stabilize these organizations. I'm excited that today's forum will explore one largely untapped opportunity: reducing the often excessive administrative burden on nonprofits. From the application process to systems for reporting and auditing, city and state contracts contain numerous requirements that are redundant, time-consuming, and unnecessarily complicated, and which cause nonprofits to divert resources, time, and staff to filling out paperwork. Today, our goal is to identify some particularly maddening administrative requirements and flesh out specific steps that city and state policymakers can take to ease this burden on New York's nonprofits while still ensuring accountability. We have a great set of panelists here today. In fact, we have 2 excellent panels. Please do stick around for both of them. The first is going to feature 5 really wonderful nonprofit leaders in the field here in New York. The second is going to involve 4 excellent, amazing government leaders. They're going to help figure out where we go from here. Thanks again to HSC for partnering with us on this event. Another big thank you to our sponsor, Ponce Bank. In fact, I now have the great pleasure of introducing Kim Ramos, Vice President and Director of External Affairs at Ponce Bank. Please join me in welcoming Kim.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning all to those that are present and watching via live stream. Ponce is proud to partner with the Center for Urban Future and HSC to host this important conversation on strengthening New York City's human services nonprofits by reducing their administrative burden, and thank the distinguished panelists for participating today. Since 1960, Ponce Bank has been a community institution serving low to moderate income communities. We are the largest FDIC bank, certified Hispanic-led bank east of the Mississippi, one of the largest CDFIs, and one of the largest Hispanic-led, #1 minority deposit institution for community financing. We have a history of building and maintaining strong relationships with the communities we serve by connecting with diverse nonprofits, local small businesses, and community-based organizations. Organizations such as the ones represented here and virtually, they're integral to the communities we serve, and their work has become even more vital to bridge the health and economic gaps that have only widened since the pandemic. Our human service nonprofits, like many frontline workers, step up in heroic ways to meet the growing demand for safety net services during the past 2 years, and are now financially vulnerable, jeopardizing their ability to continue supporting hundreds of thousands of struggling New Yorkers. But Ponce Bank remains committed to working with and supporting these organizations through partnerships that have provided hundreds of financial literacy programs, grants of over $1.3 million since 2017 through our Ponce de Leon Foundation. And for those who are applying, the deadline is tomorrow, so please get those applications in by close of business tomorrow. Our community involvement and support, our financial support of many community organizations throughout the 4 boroughs and New Jersey, our volunteerism, and our affordable banking mission, which commits over 60% of investments to low and moderate income communities that we serve. We are proud to be associated with and support the discussions to help strengthen the work of the New York City Human Services nonprofits and recognize their commitment and passion helping others, which is consistent with the values and the mission of Ponce Bank. We invite you to learn more about us and ways that we can be helpful. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'd like to ask Eli, who will be our moderator on the first panel, to join us. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thanks so much, Kim. Can you hear me? All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Oh, we still early in the morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Here in the room, all over New York City, wherever you may be tuning in from, a little beach cabana somewhere. My name is Eli Dvorkin. I'm the Editorial and Policy Director at the Center for an Urban Future. It is my great pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Let me briefly introduce our amazing panelists, and then we'll get right into the conversation. And we will save some time for questions at the end of this panel, so I'm sure folks already are full of ideas, suggestions, questions, but please save them, and we'll make sure we get to as many as possible. So without further ado, let me introduce to my right, Fred Schack. Mr. Schack is the CEO of Urban Pathways, a leading nonprofit serving homeless New Yorkers. He began his tenure there as executive director in 2005 and has served previously for 14 years as senior vice president of client services and public policy at Help USA. And among many other positions, Fred is also the former vice chair of the board for the Human Services Council and was co-chair of the Human Services Recovery Task Force from COVID-19. Fred, great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're also joined today by Maria Lizardo. Maria is the executive director of the Northern Manhattan Improvement Corporation, a settlement house providing services to 14,000 community members annually. Maria joined NMIC as director of social services in 1998, and before NMIC was at Promesa, a multi-service agency in the Bronx. And she's also a board member of the Human Services Council. Maria, great to have you with us. We're also joined today by Ben Tomasas. Ben is the executive director of Queens Community House, a multi-service settlement house serving communities in 15 neighborhoods across Queens. Prior to this role, Ben was executive vice president for programs at CEDCO, a national nonprofit that advances economic opportunity, and we're so grateful to have Ben with us today as well. To Ben's right, we are joined by Jihei Fisher. Jihei is the executive director of the Korean American Family Service Center. and was previously the director of programs there. She has also was appointed member of the Fatality Review Committee by the Mayor's Office as well, and serves on the boards of the Korean American Association in Greater New York and Mekong NYC. Great to have you with us. And last but certainly not least, to my far right, we are joined today as well by Janelle Ferris. Janelle is President and Executive Director of Brooklyn Community Services, which she's led since 2018. Janelle previously worked as the Associate Director of the Pratt Center for Community Development and at Common Ground, where she was the Director of the largest single occupancy supportive housing facility in the country. Well, great to have you with us. Welcome, Janelle. So I'd love to start today by talking a little bit, maybe Fred, I'll turn to you, not just because you're on my right, but also because you've been working on these issues for, let's say, quite some time now. And I think Fred, also having been so closely involved with supporting the sector in its recovery, as well as the city's recovery from the pandemic. I want to start with asking a little bit about why this is so important today. I think there's very little doubt, I'm sure, among folks in this room, that human services organizations have become more important in New York City than ever before, providing services at a time when, among other things, food insecurity has spiked over 50%, when more New Yorkers are experiencing homelessness, mental health crises. But at the same time, human services organizations have faced enormous challenges of their own, including financial challenges, challenges with staffing, challenges with reimbursements from the additional expenses that have been accrued as a result of the pandemic. So why is it important to tackle something as seemingly wonky as administrative challenges and burdens at a time like this? Why is this important for the health of the human services sector? Why is this important for New York City?
Well, honestly, if the city recognizes that the human services sort of sector is critical to its survival, then it must recognize that in order for us to do what we do, and we demonstrated that during Sandy, we demonstrated that during COVID-19, when the city was shut down, the city was totally abandoned. My workers were on the subways, coming into work every day, feeding individuals, reaching out to people who were living on the street to make sure that they had a place to go. They didn't take a break. So the city really does rely on us. The reality is that the burdens that impact us from the city administratively really do interfere with our ability to be productive and creative and flexible to respond to situations like that. COVID will not be the last crisis that the city faces. And the reality is that if the city wants to make sure that it can endure and survive the next major crisis, it's going to need to make sure that the sector is vital and strong and sort of still available to us.
I appreciate that, Fred. Well, let me turn to you, Ben. We talked a little bit about this just last week, but with the context that it's so important now to support New Yorkers through the human services organizations that support them every day, why is it that these burdens are disrupting your work, are inhibiting you from being able to do more, are standing in the way of using your dollars more efficiently? What is it that drives your staff crazy about this process, or that makes them, stay up late at night dealing with these systems? What are the things that really stand in the way of being more efficient and more effective in your operations when it comes to these burdens?
There are a huge number, more honestly than we have time to talk about during today's panel, but I'll give a few examples. So two really prominent examples from the youth services field that are specific to our Queens Community House has a large portfolio of DYCD funded after-school programs. Most of them are based in school buildings. So those programs are subject to something called the SAC licensing process, the school-age child care licensing process. That means that even in a school building where children are all day, we have to separately certify that a school building, which has school children in all day long, is a safe place for children to be after school. And this is an incredibly cumbersome process that includes our staff, our program director, having to take a separate class, actually, unless they, strangely enough, the only way you can get out of this class is if they have a degree in early childhood education in serving young people from age 0 to 5, even though the population that we serve in after school is 6 to 14. It is truly Kafkaesque. And also the background check process for those young people, we have two separate background, for the programs that serve those young people, we have two separate background check processes. So again, there's the DOE PETS background check process so people who work in school buildings, like in DOE community schools contracts, you have the PETS clearance. That's all you need. So you could have a social worker meeting one-on-one with a student with only a PETS clearance. But in after school, you need both the PETS clearance and a separate State Department, City Department of Health / State OCFS clearance. And there's no real reason why you should need those two clearances. If it's good enough for the DOE contracts during the school day, it should be good enough for aftercare and after school. And we have people we hire and then keep on staff. The normal amount of time is 3 months. So normally we just pay someone not to work with young people for 3 months while we wait for their clearance to go through because of this extra requirement. So that's like just an example of the huge amount of waste that's in these systems. Just a couple of other examples. One is around budget submissions and vouchering processes. So it is often the case that we spend many, many hours of staff time going back and forth over vouchers. There are certain kinds of vouchers, for instance, that the city requires us to have original invoices for. That means if we scan the invoices and email them, it's not good enough. We actually have to mail in the original invoices. So if those get lost in the mail, then we have to go back to the vendor that we purchased the product from and ask them to create a new original invoice to remail it. And we're often waiting for payment, spending hours and hours of staff time to do this. And sometimes it's for items that cost, maybe $500 out of a $500,000 contract, and we're spending $2,000 worth of staff time to get reimbursed for $500 worth of, because $500 worth of goods because we don't have the original invoice. And also, I just want to talk about the auditing process for a minute, and then I'll shut up. I got a lot to say about this before. I want to read a section from a recent DFTA audit that we received.
We could just lower the lights and get a spotlight on Ben at this point.
So this is so Queens Community House in fiscal year 19, we had 6 DFTA contracts. We received audits for all of them 3 years later during fiscal year 22. So one of the findings from one of the audits, which was repeated slightly different words and numbers in every one of these audits, was out of the 155 vendor invoices that totaled $86,518.58 for FY19, OTPS expenditures reviewed by DFTA auditors, there were 13% that totaled $15,000 and change, 18% of the amount tested, that were paid late, ranging from 3 days to 24 days, average of 8 days after the due date. I'm going to stop you here. This was a finding. I'm thinking like, wait, we paid 85% of our invoices on time, and the 15% that were late were an average of 8 days late. I'm like high-fiving my fiscal staff. Do we get, is part of this that we get to find out what the average number of days late DFTA paid our invoices was? Because somehow, I'm sure that the average number of days late was far in excess of that. The amount of money we were owed was far in excess of that. And somehow my fiscal team managed to make money out of I don't know what and pay our invoices much faster than the funder was paying us. And to add insult to injury, we get an audit finding for that magic. And I have to say, this was repeated in all 6 of the DFTA audits. So every taxpayer in New York City is paying for DFTAs to pay an outside audit firm to write this nonsense down, and then paying for my staff to respond to this nonsense. It is an incredibly wasteful process. And I'll just say that it goes on to note the section of DFTA's fiscal manual, which is this in violation of, and to note that we are at risk of damaging our programs because the vendors may not want to work with us anymore if we don't pay them on time, as if we don't know how to manage our vendors and pay the ones that really need to be paid and stretch out the ones who can afford to be stretched. So it's just really remarkable and frustrating. Anyone else want to talk now? Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I'd love to hear more about that. Same question, these specific examples. Maria, let me ask you, in part because you're wearing a shirt today that I think reflects some of your concerns about the sector. But this is as important as those issues are, maybe the single most important issue. Just ensuring sufficient pay for the human services workforce is part of this equation, but we're here to talk today about these administrative burdens, and I think it maybe is less understanding how these burdens affect your workforce. And we're talking about over 200,000 New Yorkers who are employed in the human services sector broadly, 80,000 of whom are employed directly in these contracted roles. Are your staff suffering as a result of these burdens? What did they tell you bothers them the most about this process, and where would you like to see those changes made?
So first of all, just pay us, pay our workforce, and pay us on time. Just pay. This is not the most exciting conversation, but it is so necessary. And I want to give kudos to Ambrosia, who just left this role at NYMIC, that we had to create in order to move our contracts because they are so convoluted and so complex. And I know the city has made progress, and there is an effort and intention to make things better. But till then, we have a lot of work to do. So I do want to give 2 concrete examples of how cumbersome this process is. DYCD, please. Why do we have to enter stuff into your Connect PTS system? Why do we have to hire a full-time person to do double data entry? So we do have a case management system, Client Track, so our staff inputs their data there, and we had to hire someone to then go back into Client Track and put that same information from Client Track into Connect PTS. That is ridiculous. That is a case manager, that is a paralegal that could be providing direct services, and yet we have to spend this money and resources in creating this position. The state, please, let's not even get into the state. OCFS, why are we getting award letters in the mail? What is wrong with email? Please explain that to me. And then we have to do all the contract documents, print them, and mail them. I'm sorry, United States Postal Service, I don't want to put you out of business. But why can we not just email all these documents or put them in Grants Gateway? There is such a thing at the state level as Grants Gateway. Why, OCFS, do you insist on having us send each a contract packet for each grant that we have under your office? Why can't we just put all the essential documents in Grants Gateway and you pull them from there? These are just 2 concrete examples that really have hindered our ability to have more conversations around strategic planning, around how do we re-envision, reimagine the services that we're there to provide, and yet we have to divert resources into creating positions just to deal with these cumbersome administrative processes that take away from these conversations. Once again, the folks doing this work, kudos to you because you are heroes and sheroes because you do this every day and you move contracts and you move our reporting through our organizations, and I bless you for the work that you do.
Thanks, Maria. I want to follow up on that point about the different systems where you're obligated to report, to produce documents, but I also just wanted to open up the broader question, to Janelle, to Jihei, to Fred. What are these requirements that are most troublesome for your staff, that drive them wild, that suck up the most staff time, that take you away from your mission? If you want to share any of the concrete examples of those things first, we'd love to hear those examples.
Well, morning, everybody. I'm going to just jump back to SAC licenses for a second. SAC licenses are a part of the Department of Health. They are the ones who either give it or don't give it. Programs that work with youth need one if you want to provide more than one service. So you can either not have a SAC license and only do homework help, or you can have a SAC license and have photography, geography, nutrition, dancing, sports. Now, if your program is set in NYCHA housing, or if your program is set in a after-school facility at a DOE school, they don't necessarily have to follow the DOH recommendations. So, if they don't have to meet the requirements of the Department of Health, you'll never get a SAC license. So we are hired by the city to provide a wide variety of services for youth. Our desire is to expand young people's minds to see the opportunities that are available to them, to open their eyes to careers they've never seen before. But we can only do one thing, because we can't get the SAC license, because we can't. So you're prevented from providing the services that you need to by somewhat archaic regulations that are between 3 and 4 different agencies that need to get on the same page so that we can provide services for youth. It's a convoluted problem that could easily be solved with some cooperation between multiple agencies.
So, hi everybody. My name is Jiha Fisher from the Korean American Family Service Center. We provide support to the immigrant survivors of gender-based violence, and I echo all the colleagues here around the auditing process, to the contracting process, to the procurement, and for KFSC. As we're relatively a small nonprofit organization with a $4 million operating budget, and does a lot of different work to provide essential services to the community members, like all of us here in this room, and which means that we also have many different contracts with many different city agencies, but there's no streamlined process or centralized way of doing from the contracting process to the procurements to the auditing. And that's something that we always worry about. And all the city contracts are reimbursement based. So cash flow is something that we worry about constantly. And especially during the COVID, when there was a financial crisis, this is something that I could not sleep for days, for months, because of the cash flow issues. So I think I think we're stuck. Many of us, our nonprofit human service providers, are stuck with being reactive to the this contracting process, not proactive around changing the process. So I'm really happy to be here to discuss it further.
So I'm going to actually pick up on something that Maria said. Ben covered the auditing issues fairly in great detail. Thank you, Ben. But for me, the thing that concerns me the most is the fact that our case managers, the people who are providing direct services to our clients, are grossly underpaid and overworked. And the duplication of reporting, the duplication associated with reporting.
Bring it closer to you.
The duplications that we experience with case recording is somewhat overwhelming. So for us, we have had for about 20 some odd years a comprehensive digital case record. We have programs that span from outreach, where we're engaging individuals who are on the streets of the city, to permanent housing. And that single case record can track that client across our entire sector. So if a client is engaged on the street, we create a case record. That person then goes into one of our safe havens. And if that person ends up in our supportive housing program, we have all the documented history of all of the services that we provided to that particular individual. The City of New York has a digital case record. DHS has one. DOHMH has another one. They are requiring our staff to input into those systems as well. The disadvantage there is that we can't track our KPIs. We can't track whether or not I can sit in my office and we can run a report to determine whether or not we're meeting our targets, we're meeting our deliverables. If I'm using only the city system, two things. A, you put information in, you can't get information out, and it doesn't track the clients across the programs. It is a major, major drain. But to add insult to injury, they also require us to maintain a paper record. So we use our system because our system is comprehensive. It provides really good input. It makes sure that the case manager, the new case manager, has a complete history of the client services. However, the city also requires that we maintain those records on paper so that when they come out to audit, they're not using their digital record to audit. They're using our paper record to do the audit. And that requires, so every hour, every minute that a worker isn't able to do a collateral visit, to go out into the community and connect with the client, to help them make connections with drug treatment or mental health services, then they're sitting in their offices either filing or doing double entry into a case management system. It makes absolutely no sense. The federal government allows us to upload directly into their system our data. If the city were able to allow us to do that, we can get them all the data they want, probably more than they need, okay, without the duplication. So that would be a major benefit if, in fact, they would reduce the burden that impact our ability to work directly with our clients.
Actually, HRA allows us to do that. So they provide us the Excel spreadsheet. We're able to run the reports on our on client track and upload it to HRA. So HRA has figured it out. DYCD, DFTA, you need to figure it out too.
Let me follow up on that, Maria, because I think not a lot of folks fully understand those complexities. And part of this, I think, also impacts the transition toward the passport system. So I wanted to ask in general about when it comes to technology, what's needed from government to make your processes and systems more efficient? I think, Fred, you just spoke to that a little bit. Is the transition to the passport system, this sort of unified system, working? Is it working compared to, HHS Accelerator or its predecessors, and compared to your own systems, whether whatever software you may be using, whether it's Salesforce or the platform that you're using, Maria, how does that compare to what the city is requiring of you when it comes to reporting on your contracts, your metrics, your outcomes, et cetera?
Ben is ready, go back.
Well, I just think it's worth clarifying. There's a lot of different technology systems that we're talking about here that serve different purposes. So what Fred and Maria are talking about is how do we handle program participant data? And then the passport system is a contracting system, right? And so there's challenges and issues with both. I think Fred covered the challenges and issues with the data systems extremely well, and I just co-sign. With passport, I think these systems are improvements over the old paper-based systems, but there are glitches in them. We've had contracts that just get lost in passport for sometimes months at a time. So Queens Community House. We provide services for people of all ages. We have a budget of about $30 million. We had an advance that was a $500,000 advance that was just sort of lost in passport for a month, and that makes life very difficult, right? For an organization like us, that's about one biweekly payroll, just to give you a sense. So, and I think, and a lot of times the challenges seem to be that the people at the agencies don't seem to know how to use passport. So that is something that it was a recommendation of the Joint Task Force on Nonprofit Contracting that the controller and the mayor convened during the transition. That just extensive training for all agency staff who are using passport would really facilitate an improved transition.
And for our staff, who have to deal with these glitches, so when these glitches come up, they spend hours just trying to figure it out and, navigating and then contacting, the passport team who also don't know how to navigate it. So we spend countless hours just trying to figure it out. Yes, it is an improvement, but we have a lot more work to do.
One thing I forgot to say, sorry, also is that the systems are not that transparent to the nonprofits. So there's a lot more information that agency staff can see that we can't see, and it just touches on this question of sort of are we partners or are we sort of this sort of to be kept at arm's length. So when things are sitting in passport, we don't know whether it's moved from one part of an agency to another or from an agency to Mox, and it makes it much harder for us to know who we need to ask to move it along or how much longer we're going to wait for the contract to be registered.
Well, I wanted to ask a little bit also about, there is change in the air. You mentioned, obviously, the task force that has produced a set of recommendations. The first major announcement since then has been unlocking of contracted dollars totaling nearly $5 billion. And no, that's a process. That doesn't just appear in your bank accounts overnight. But obviously, this is a real commitment from government to start to improve some of these processes. I asked, my question here is when it comes down to the agency level, where have you seen some of improvements, if any, already taking shape? Meaning, are there some best practices out there, some leadership that you've seen that's actually translated to meaningful improvements when it comes to processes on the ground? But conversely, are there other agencies where you'd like to highlight there's a real need to focus at the highest levels on making some of these process improvements? I'm interested in the state level, the city level, and I know obviously you've mentioned, certainly it sounds like some real challenges around the systems at place for DFTA, for DYCD, but help me understand a little bit better, where are you seeing some improvements? What specifically is working that you'd like to see continue, if anything, at this point? Where would you like to see the most focus in terms of where there's the greatest amount of ground to cover to improve these systems and processes, to improve training or practices, or otherwise alleviate some of these burdens at the agency level?
So let me start by referencing something that I think has worked well and has worked well for years. We have contracts with the State Office of Mental Health. We have multiple contracts, and I don't know that they refer to it as a master contract, but the reality is all of our contracts get consolidated. So it's really seamless. The other thing that's really amazing about the way the State OMH operates is that they pay us quarterly advances, like clockwork. If our paperwork is in on time to get the contract registered, we'll get a first quarterly payment of the quarter of the full budget by the end of June. We'll get another one 4 months from there, another one 4 months after, and then they reconcile at the end of the period. So there's not this, ongoing billing process back and forth. Absolutely incredible. The other thing that's really, really, really helpful with the state is that they allow us the flexibility of utilizing underspent funds on one contract to support another state contract that is in distress. And again, absolutely incredible. It really does make a difference. We'll find situations where we'll have an unexpected expense in one of our buildings. We have some surpluses in another program. We can just move those surpluses over, and then we reconcile again at the end of the year with the state. So that's a system that has operated as long as I've been in my role. And I don't know why the city, state is government, city is government. I'm not sure why the city can't replicate that model.
I actually echo with Freddie. So we have contracts with Office of Victims, OVS, and the DCJS, and it's been we've been paid quarterly, and it's been really helping us a lot with the cash flow. But the city level, we haven't seen enhancement much. But I have to say the passport system has been more centralized, and it's easier for us to communicate with the city agencies.
I don't have as many happy stories to tell. What I really appreciate is that it seems that we have a window of an administration that wants to make positive change. And the latest announcement that they are making it easier for agencies to put amended increases into our current contracts rather than requiring us to submit an amendment and then wait for that to get approved. I'm waiting for amendments to contracts let in 2020 to get paid. So the cash flow problem has as much to do with promises of money through contracts that have not been registered, not been processed, than anything else. But, each time we have a positive advance, like indirect, which finally in the city, a recognition that we should be paid the cost of doing business. Each time we have an improvement, like let's not make agencies get an amendment on a contract when we have promised them a COLA increase for their staff. They should just get it. Each time we get one of these things, we also need to watch how agencies implement the change and make sure that they're doing it in a way that's advantageous to agencies rather than penalize. And when I say penalize, I mean if you get a promise of an increase and you give it to your staff, and then you have to wait for a year, maybe 2, to get the money, you now are borrowing. We're using lines of credit. Some of us get bridge loans in order to meet our cash flow, to pay our staff. So that money, which is promised, is in the ether, waiting. I have contracts that have been, we've completed the work, and we're still waiting to get the contract registered. It's a problem. And so, if you have to wait for a year, 2, sometimes 3, in order to get the funds that you are promised, you're creating an agency, a sector that can fail, that can collapse on itself due to excessive borrowing and interest rates, which you then have to raise money to pay. It's a very dangerous game, and I think that as we see improvements, including Passport, it's not just technology that makes a system work, it's human beings. And so how we communicate using technology is as important as the technology itself. We have to look at how things are implemented and encourage agencies to make efficient transitions.
I want to give my friends in government some credit for some of their good work. I did work in city government. I worked in the mayor's office as the food policy coordinator before my time at CEDCO, before my time at Queens Community House. And there's a lot of great people in government who are working hard to improve these systems. And Passport and HHS Accelerator and Grants Gateway are all innovations that have made things better, right? That we used to have to, upload our Char 500 over, or mail it in over and over again, or email it over and over again. Now we just upload it, and it's there in the system, and people can see when it's there. When it needs to be updated, we update it once. And so to me, that's a roadmap for what should be a vouchering and payment system. Why do I have to mail in original proof of purchase? Why do I have to email over and over again vouchers? My staff often emails back up for vouchers to agency employees, and then they don't see the email, and then we need to resend it. So if there was a comparable system for vouchering and payment where it could be uploaded and everybody could see what was there and what wasn't there, and everybody could see how long it had been sitting there, and it was transparent to the nonprofit sector so we could see whether it had been looked at, what the status of the payment was, that would save the nonprofit sector thousands and thousands of hours and millions of dollars of staff time.
I just want to add, but there also needs to be consistency across city agencies as well as state agencies. The fact that DYCD has its own separate system is ridiculous. The fact that OCFS requires us to mail things is ridiculous. And we haven't even touched upon discretionary contracts, which a lot of organizations get, smaller nonprofits who struggle to get that money out of the city. It's ridiculous. So we need to start focusing on discretionary contracts as well, because we're waiting on one from fiscal year 21 that we're still waiting for it to be registered. And had it not been that, for our focus on making sure that our invoices are paid, we would be struggling with cash flow. And we've come close in the past to not meeting payroll. And I know of organizations that have not met payroll. And when you do that, your workforce loses confidence in you. And it is not your fault. We are doing the work. The work is getting done, but the city and state need to pay us, and they need to have the processes in place and use us as their partners. We have a lot of knowledge on the ground of how this is working or not working, so please consult with us, bring us to the table. We can work with you.
Maria, I think to that point, the research shows, among other things, about half of all human services organizations in New York City have borrowed money just to cover costs while they're waiting for contracts to be reimbursed, accruing interest, which is not reimbursed. But also to your point around those discretionary contracts, maybe just to help make sure everybody in our audience is following along. But in some cases, we're talking about dollars from city council members, as little as $1,500 here, $5,000 there. One organization that we interviewed as part of our ongoing research around this told us that there are 26 separate documents required to process if what was in their case a $5,000 discretionary grant. It was actually 36 individual documents compiled into 26 different pieces of documentation. And for a $5,000 grant, they told us, we're basically losing funds. We really appreciate the opportunity to gain that kind of additional support, but we're coming out on the wrong end of that, and just in terms of staff time. And it sounds like that's something you've heard as well. Let me ask something to follow up on that other point. Thinking around about accountability here. I think this is a real challenge for the entire system. And perhaps this brings us back to auditing, Ben, although you certainly covered it really, really powerfully earlier. But how should government officials think about balancing the need for accountability, the need to protect public dollars, with the realities that you're all describing, which is that these systems and processes are wasting public dollars, arguably. They're costing public dollars that are not going toward the provision of services. But at the same time, there's obviously a need to ensure that there is accountability in place. Maybe this is just a specific focus. We could talk a little bit about recommendation solutions here, but how could or should the auditing process be revisited to maintain accountability while reducing some of these unnecessary costs and burdens? Where else can you see efficiencies or savings or improvements that still balance the need for accountability in these systems as well?
So we have probably 16 or 17 separate city contracts. There have been times where there have been multiple city audits going on at the same time, while we're also trying to do our annual consolidated contract, or consolidated audit. The reality is that it would probably make more sense if the city were either to cap the number of audits or to figure out a way to consolidate their auditing process so that they're auditing multiple programs in one audit, as opposed to doing 5, 6, 7 audits a year of our programs, which is a major drain on our staff in terms of the amount of time that it takes them to pull material and to respond to questions. But it's also a waste of city resources in terms of the number of audits that they're engaging private auditors to do.
I just want to say, for the record, right, I'm strongly in favor of reasonable accountability measures. I think we're all aware that there have been instances and are instances of waste and fraud in the nonprofit sector. Not nearly as many as the media coverage would sometimes make it appear, but it does happen. But it's relatively simple. You asked the question of how can we balance these things, and the cost-benefit analysis should be the method. So you're asking yourself, how much additional protection does an original invoice versus an emailed scan of an invoice provide the public against waste? I would say 0. I would say that the cost there is very, very high and the benefit is 0. How much additional benefit? The background checks is a great example. I would never, ever want to run programs for children where staff had not been background checked. But how much additional benefit is there to the second background check? I would say 0. The cost is very, very high, right? How much benefit is there to carefully, require looking over the backup documentation for a $500 purchase? There's some benefit, but it's minimal. And so these systems, or for a $5,000 discretionary contract. So the systems have to be designed so that $500 purchases receive less scrutiny than $50,000 purchases, and $5,000 contracts receive less scrutiny than $50,000 or $500,000 contracts. And it's not rocket science. Companies, governments, and organizations across the world have designed systems where there's commensurate scrutiny for different kinds of expenses, so that the cost benefit of the scrutiny is on the plus side for the benefits, right? And so it just feels like in our interactions with government, that is totally out of whack. I have audit findings. I could have read more and more from that audit. I have audit findings for like $11 purchases. Like, it's not even worth the time for the audit firm to write that sentence, let alone for me to read it and write a corrective action. So.
Thanks, Ben. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, and the audit. Speaking of auditing process,
It's like an amen chorus here, right?
So we have audit from different departments, but even for preparing the documents for one audit for one department, it takes up a lot of time of our staff. And when we prepare it, we submit it. We have all kinds of different findings, like Ben had. Ours was actually a $12 one. Yours was $11. And it takes a long time to prepare. But not only that, year after year, the standard of these audit process, it varies depending on the person who's auditing it. So one year we had findings that were the issue, so we prepare it for the upcoming year, but that wasn't the issue the following year, but there's something else. Our staff members, they're preparing a lot of time they're spending a lot of time to prepare for these documents, but year after year, it's very confusing. Frankly, we don't know how to actually prepare for the audit. The findings are actually helpful for the process during the fiscal year.
Let me ask you all one last question, then I'll turn it over to our amazing audience. But I'd love to build on some things that have been said just in the last 10 minutes around some of the solutions here. And I think some of them, it sounds to me like, are relatively low-hanging fruit. Maybe that's really the place to start. There's some big, huge, thorny structural challenges here, but there's also some relatively low-hanging fruit that could be changed without an enormous push. I'd love to hear from all of you about what are some of maybe the smaller things, but the really tangible things where, maybe I'll hand out a magic wand to each of you. What would you change right away that's relatively low-hanging fruit, or it could be, a little bit of a bigger challenge, but where there's a really tangible solution to some of your problems? And I'd love to hear from all of you about some of those concrete, specific changes that you'd like to see happen right away.
I think, jumping in now, I think hats off to Maria for bringing this up, but it's not that hard to get all of the agency's staff to buy into Passport, to offers training for our employees as well. It's not that difficult to ensure that all of us are using the same systems, that it becomes routine to go there first before you ask us to send the documents that have been sitting in it for a year. It's not that difficult to shift the way in which we use a tool that is actually pretty good, and it could even be broadened to handle some of the audit capacities, such as Ben was talking about.
If I could just jump in there while we're talking about training agency staff, this was something that was actually discussed extensively in the Joint Task Force and didn't make it to the recommendations. But one of the hard things about working with agency staff is the culture of the staff, sort of the organizational culture of the staff that we deal with every day is one of sort of opposition to the nonprofit sector. Their default assumption is that we are trying to do things badly, trying to get one over, and to ask a lot of challenging questions. And it is routine daily for us to sort of have to escalate things 1, 2, 3, 4 steps up the org chart inside a government agency to get a reasonable answer. Because there are always people at the program director or assistant commissioner level who seem to see us as partners and want us to succeed. But the amount of time that's wasted in that escalation, both for us and for the city agencies and the highest paid city agency employees, is huge. And so just a retraining of the agency staff. One problem that I didn't get a chance to talk about in my very long initial remarks was sort of budget submissions and budget modifications. So one problem that could be fixed very quickly is a lot of city agencies don't allow us to modify the original contract budget from at the beginning of the contract year. So the contract budget automatically defaults to the budget that we submitted in response to an RFP 4 or 5 years ago. And then we have to modify it throughout the year rather than carrying forward modifications we've submitted at some point in a prior year. And then when we do modify the budget, it's met with such skepticism, like, last year you paid the program director $55,000. This year you're paying her $58,500.
Why?
What? I reject this modification. You want to decrease the program consultants and pay your program director more? No. And then we go to, and oftentimes my staff will come to me and I will call a deputy commissioner at an agency to get a few $1,000s of a modification approved. And so just getting agency commissioners and senior leadership from the central, from the mayor's office, the governor's office, the Office of Contracts, to bring these staff together and say, your job is to make these nonprofits programs successful,
That is your job. If everybody at every government agency understood that as their job, or at least was reminded that that was their job several times a year, I think that the world in which we operate would be very, very different, and taxpayer money would be much better spent.
When it comes to everything Ben said, when it comes to reporting, definitely providing us with an Excel spreadsheet so we can extrapolate the data from our databases and put in the Excel spreadsheet and then send it to the agencies. That would, I mean, I'm sorry, we would have to eliminate our data reporting person, but we can get a case manager or a paralegal. So I think streamlining the reporting process is low-hanging fruit. HRA has figured it out, HUD has figured it out, the rest of the city and the state can figure it out.
Maria, just to understand, that in that scenario, the data would actually be uploaded on the agency side. It would come from you in an Excel file, exactly. Standardized to all agencies. They would upload it on their end. Yeah.
And I believe that we have a responsibility for changing our behavior. The reality is that the city has been enabled by virtue of the fact that many of us will begin providing services without having a contract registered. I think we've got to get better at saying no. Register the contract, get it registered on time, and then we'll provide services. But this idea of fronting the services, being in a position where we're waiting years and years to get our contracts registered and the payment is something that just reinforces that bad behavior. And the other thing, and I know how low-hanging fruit it is, but the idea of accountability. The reality is that, when we were working with the last administration and we pointed out the fact that contracts were late 90% of the time, no one was held accountable. The commissioner of the agency, the senior staff of the agency, there was absolutely no accountability for their failure. When we don't get something right, we're held accountable. The city should be held accountable as well.
Thanks, Fred. And go ahead, Janelle. Then I want to really turn it over to our audience as well.
I promise. My agency is somewhat notorious for working on contracts where it's not been registered. Part of that is that families who were affected from Hurricane Ida with no place to go need case management. We've been providing it for over a year, and the contract hasn't been registered. What are you going to do? Just let those families suffer? We have school contracts. School begins, what? Y'all parents, you could shout it out.
Next week.
Right? We got programs that we need to get started. We need to hire the staff. We need to register the kids. Contract not registered. We're refusing to start because I can't hire any staff. I can't create the flyers. I can't design the program. And what's going to happen is we're going to be penalized because we have low enrollment. Because the likelihood is that contract is not going to get registered until 2 months after school has begun. And then, if I'm lucky, I hear over here that's true.
Lucky, it's 2
right?
months.
So then we start. Parents have figured out what to do with their kids after school, and then we will get penalized for low enrollment, and it will reflect our ability to get paid as we need to hire staff and gear up quickly and hire contractors. So there's this line with contract registration that is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And what needs to happen, the behavior that needs to change is the city needs to register contracts before the start date on the contract. Does that seem like it should be make that the easy lift?
Well, thank you all. I hate to do this, but there'll be time to answer the questions as well, and you can bring that in. But I do really want to get to our amazing audience who've been, I'm sure, lots of thoughts. Let me just say, folks have questions, ideas. There are microphones on both sides of the house, so just please raise your hand. A microphone will come to you. I'll call you out. I'll point to you. The microphone will come to you. Please just say your name, any organization that you're with, and please try to keep your questions short so we can get to as many folks as possible. And if you just want to throw a hand up, if folks have questions or comments, I would like to jump in, and then our team can bring a microphone to you. I received one right on the right side. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Scott Short, CEO of Riseboro Community Partnership. I want to thank the panel for articulating all these issues that the nonprofit sector faces so clearly and concisely. I think although we've got a lot of common sense solutions that you guys put out there, one of my impressions of why we can't get even this low-hanging fruit that most people would agree on solutions across the finish line is because they kind of fall in between the cracks of the agency staff, the controller's office, MOCS, City Hall, the City Council. You know, even though there's often simple solutions, there's no clear responsibility or authority for a single entity to make those changes. So wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of how we could solve that more structural problem.
Isn't that what the Office of Nonprofit is supposed to be doing when they find an executive director and staff it up? Should it be there? Should that be the place? And will that office really have real power, or will it be for show just to, keep us quiet? So I think you highlight a very important point, which is about accountability. Who is really going to take the lead with this? Who is really going to make sure that all these moving parts are working together? And I would ask the city to really make sure that this office has the power to move some of the things that we're speaking about today, but to really putting a call out to the sector. We need to be fierce advocates when it comes to all of this. And I think we've made progress when it comes to this, and I do thank HSC for taking the lead on, just pay and, some of these conversations. But we need to stop being afraid. We need to start saying no. If you're not fully funding us to do this work, no, I will not do this contract. No, I will not start it on time if you're gonna pay me a year later. No, if you're not gonna give us the COLA for our staff, I'm not doing this work. And so we need to be emboldened as a sector to use our collective voices to move things. But I do hope that this Office of Nonprofit Services can play a big role and a major role in moving some of this agenda item forward.
Thanks, Maria. And Scott, thanks for the question. I also wanted to mention we have, I think, almost 200, perhaps over 200 folks tuned in live online right now as well. If you all have questions, you can tweet at NYC Future on Twitter. I can see your question there, and I'm happy to share those as well. But any other questions or comments or ideas from the House, feel free to throw a hand up. I see we have a typically quiet crowd of human services folks. That's pretty atypical. Okay, at the top right there, fantastic. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Liz Roberts. I'm the CEO of Safe Horizon. This has been a fantastic panel, and I was nodding so hard as you all were speaking that I'm going to have a neck ache for the rest of the week because you hit, all of the major pain points that we struggle with every year. As I was listening to you, I was, thinking about this is not low-hanging fruit, but I was thinking about what would be a true structural fix. And a true structural fix to this problem would be actually to delegate the responsibility for contracting to each of the city agencies and hold them accountable instead of requiring them to go through so many different city oversight steps in order to move any contract forward. And I imagine there are all kinds of things that would stand in the way of that. But I think that's what we should be calling for. And I want to put that on the table.
Thank you for any responses from the folks on the panel. More potential neck injuries. Thank you for that. Other questions from folks in the House? I see on the left side, and then we'll go to the center.
Good morning. My name is Sal Lapizzo. I'm Director of Veterans in Command. We house homeless veterans and other individuals coming out of institutions and shelters. I'd like to say one thing that Ben brought out, that it seems that the word nonprofit is a dirty word, and that comes across very, very strong when you're dealing with people over the phone. I hope one day that I would be in a position that you guys are in. I'm very, very small, and no disrespect, but when I heard you say you have a $5 million budget and you're a small organization, my ears went up. I have 25 men that I house. I can't keep my doors open. I drive a lift car 3 days a week in order to pay the bills. The administrations think that they're doing some good stuff sometimes. We have a program in the city called ERAP. ERAP is a good thing because when COVID happened, a lot of people that were trying to pay their mortgages couldn't. So the city, it really comes from the feds, I think. And what they did was they came up with this ERAP program so that they would cover people's rent for up to a year. But what happened now is guys or individuals that see that the city will pay for 1 year won't pay anymore. They go to work, they don't have to pay, because even though there's no money left in the ERAP program, once an individual signs up for ERAP, he's not responsible anymore for his pay. So I can't tell you how many people I have with that situation, but it hurts because I can't make the budget. So what I do is I go to work, right, and I pay it. Because I'm there, I will not close my houses. That's number one. The other thing is that we'll have a house. I find a building, I renovate it, and I gut it. We're in South Jamaica. I gut the building. Building looks great. I get guys in. Because what I try to do, I try to provide a home, not a facility, not a shelter. It's a home where these guys get on their feet, they go to work. There's nobody outside standing outside with signs saying not in my neighborhood, and that's what I do. So then the building department comes in and says there was a violation like 30 years ago, and DHS won't allow the people to come in. And they won't even do it. They won't even do an inspection. They just look online because everybody's working from home. So they look online, they see there's a violation. Now this guy can't get out of that shelter. So this is, I don't mean to be crying up here and talking, negatively, but this is a reality. And how do we do this? I really think what she said, we have to be vigilant. We have to be vigilant with our elected officials, because everybody got kind of soft. And the same way big corporations lobby, that's what we should be doing. We should be in their face. Maybe I'm naive. I don't know. But this is what I do, and I really believe that the people up here, you guys, right? You're on the upper echelon in nonprofits. There's a lot of people in the streets that are trying to open facilities, that are trying to open up pantries, trying to do shit that can't get the kind of funds that you have. So that's all I have to say. I appreciate what you're doing. I really hope that someday I could do the amount of work that you guys are doing. But right now, it's tough. Thank you.
Thank you. So I see there was a hand up right in the middle. That's great. And just we'll send the microphone over to you. And just so I can see, we have a couple minutes left. Any other hands in the house, folks that want to jump in? Okay, one more right at the top. Great. And then that'll be our last in about the 6th row there. Go ahead, thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Chai Jindasvirat. Sorry, VP of Policy at Nonprofit New York. And I think what I wanted to highlight is just I formerly, before Nonprofit New York, worked at OMB, and I think OMB is a pretty opaque and missing player in a lot of these conversations. I was an analyst, I was a budget analyst there, and I think that for a lot of these proposals and the convenings that happen, even from the OMB side, we as analysts and those of us who were supposed to be doing some of these things, we were very rarely consulted on what were some of the challenges that kept us from being able to move certain things forward. And I honestly believe, for me personally, a lot of it was that I was not trained well. And there's something that happens with that kind of opaque level of government where you have an approval role, but you also have to be, there's a spectrum where you're extremely specialized in some ways in your unit, but then there's no kind of standard or universal training for that. And so just to add some layers of complexity onto that, when it comes to budget modifications, we had to get really trained up on what were the funding formulas in the different streams and whether the revenue was actually going to be there before we were able to be doing some of those things. And sometimes we were never really trained on how to do that properly, and so it would take a really, really long time. And because there was no transparency with the process, we would sometimes get emails that were okay, this is 45 days late, 90 days late, whatever, but there was no accountability for us, and there was no accountability on that wasn't even factored into our performance evaluations. just as an example. So I know I'm like telling the like dirty secrets of of that, but I just feel like, you know, there's a level of like the folks who are doing this and want to do it really well sometimes, like they should be consulted as well, because I think they have a lot of really concrete specific examples of what's keeping them from moving the process forward.
Thanks so much.
Just speak to that for
Sure,
1
Ben, just 1 minute, because unfortunately we do have to
It'll
wrap
be
up.
less than that. I would just say, I think you again highlighted the training question, and in addition to the training question, I want to add, both for folks at OMB and for folks at agencies, almost no one is hired to work for the city or the state out of the nonprofit sector. And the people we're talking to just have no idea how things work in our programs every day. And so I think that the city and state should make a concerted effort to hire people in fiscal analyst roles who have worked in the fiscal departments of nonprofits.
Thanks, Ben. Well, I imagine we could continue this conversation for quite a while, but unfortunately this is all the time we have for this first panel. So I hope everyone here in person, online, can join me in a round of applause for amazing panelists. And thank you all so much. It's really a wonderful conversation, and please stick around. We're going to go right into our second panel. And first, it's my great pleasure to introduce Michelle Jackson, who runs the Human Services Council. Michelle.
I can dismiss you all. They're all my members looking at me. So, and I'll invite the second panel to come on up so we can, keep this program moving quickly, and I will introduce them. So thank you, everyone, for joining us live and in person. I had my nice written remarks out last night, and then I forgot how agitated I get. So I have a new, so bear with me. I have different things to say than initially planned. So first, I want to thank the Center for Urban Future, Jonathan, Stephanie, Eli. This has been a really great partnership. I really just called and complained to them about all of the administrative burdens my members face, and they put this panel together. So thank you so much for that, and thanks to Bonds Bank as well. I know we're all among friends here. Come on up. I mean, yes, exactly. Yes. Please come up so we can, keep the party going. I think it's really important when we have this conversation to point out that we're not whining, right? Like, this is not, it feels like it, and it's a safe space, and we're all just talking about, burdens that we have, but this is immediate and it's urgent, and it's important. And when we have these conversations, what we're really talking about is how we are preventing communities from getting quality services. That's the gist of the administrative burdens. At the end of the day, what human service providers do, they are people who are reaching out to the community to help people. And everything in between is a burden on making sure that those services are delivered. We should be looking at every system for necessity and starting from there. Every piece of paper that we ask nonprofits to fill out, every process is an additional burden and prevents services in the community. It doesn't mean that they're all unnecessary. It just means that's the lens that we should really have when we're looking at these administrative burdens. And I think from what people said today, why is it important? We all know the importance of human services. I had this whole set of statistics. I'm not going to go through them. I'm looking at all of my members and all of the kindred spirits in the room who know all about this. But it is an urgent conversation. I think what you heard, to pull out some of the nuggets of that, is staff leave because of these issues. If you are out of school and ready to work, and you find out you don't get to work for 3 months while you wait for your SAC license, and you're going to get paid less than what you should for your degree, you're out. When you're poor Ben's audit team, they're probably so proud of themselves for all those invoices that they got paid with no money, and then they get an audit back that says you were 8 days late, and now your executive director is going to say, how do we write up this finding? Instead of, sure, Ben said great job, and this is dumb, but that's what we're telling staff at human services organizations, that their time isn't valuable, that they're burdened with systems. I think we all know our first job when there was management who wasn't really paying attention. You're like, why am I doing these processes? And that's really what a lot of these government systems do to nonprofit workers. They can be demeaning, they certainly don't feel valued, and they leave. And that means that we can't provide quality services. Management wastes time on this. Ben having to review that audit, that's going to stick with me. The $12, $11 finding, that is stuff, that's time when management should be solving critical issues in the community, figuring out how to open new shelters to welcome migrants. How do we do that kind of work instead of reviewing audits for the 100th time? People are not served because of this. That's, I think, the real thing that we want to dig down is, Maria mentioned having to hire a new position to handle just like contracts and audit, to do data entry, to just do duplicative data entry. That's a whole staff position that could be out in the community doing different types of services. And when I say this is urgent, a couple of examples spring to mind. We all know the whole breadth of the sector, but I want to pin down two things. One, COVID. When COVID hit, the first thing my providers called me about was cash flow. Do I have to lay people off? And in my head, I was like, what? You know, your services are needed more now than ever. Like most human services certainly aren't closing. So especially for like homeless shelters and food, you know, groups that did food. It's like, what do you mean? And they were like, we're not sure we're going to meet our contract deliverables in the same way, and we have zero cash flow. So if we get dinged on anything, or if any of our contracts are delayed, we will not make payroll. So do we need to start laying people off now? That is not the conversation we should have been having the second week of COVID, but it was actually a completely critical thing because it meant, can the organization stay open at all or close? And that is because of the divestment in government and the amount of loans and contract dollars that are owed, and the lack of trust and faith, honestly, in will our government partners see our, you know, how much we're needed and come to the table and deliver. And by the way, government did come and deliver, and we had a lot of successes during COVID, but that's the operating environment of nonprofits. And even more urgently, we have people coming to New York today, last week, the last 3 weeks on buses, who have no resources and are in need of dire help. And we have a sector who's ready and standing at Port Authority with the mayor and with the controller and with our elected officials ready to greet them, but they are not resourced to greet them. Homeless shelters are owed hundreds of millions of dollars by the city and state. They cannot open a shelter on a dime, and they do not have space to house new people. They're making it work miraculously, which is like the best part of the sector, and also the worst part as an advocate to say, they keep saying yes and kind of making miracles out of nothing. But there's also a host of wraparound services. Food is needed, education is needed, legal services, and we simply can't meet the need. And that is not because providers aren't there and ready. It's because we have had our resources sucked dry, both in terms of people leaving, in terms of money owed, and in terms of management dealing with like administrative burdens that makes us unable to act in the way that we should be able to act. So that's why this conversation is so urgent and important, not because paperwork is annoying. So I just want to make sure we set the stage in that way. So we at HSC greatly value the conversation, and we'll back up at the end to talk about kind of some of the next steps, because there are next steps. This is not just a venting session, although that is important therapy. And so with that, I want to turn it over to our second panel. Brave government panel. I really want to say that. I really appreciate that you all came today knowing the conversation that we're having, and that you all are really tireless advocates for making these changes. You know, it takes a village, and everybody's doing their part, and I really appreciate that. So I'm very proud to partner with all of you for many, many years. So I want to thank first Councilmember Linda Lee, who is with us today, former nonprofit executive Fran Barrett, the interagency coordinator for nonprofit organizations. I've many, many conversations with over the years, and Ilke Denizli, the associate director of strategic initiatives for the Mayor's Office of Contract Services. Really appreciate all of the work that you all do, and for coming here today to talk about the work you are doing. And of course, thank you to Jonathan Bowles, the Executive Director for Center of Urban Future, who will be moderating the panel. So thank you, everyone.
All right, and thank you, Michelle. And thanks again for everybody being here today. So we're going to get right into it. Let me just move this microphone. And I also would encourage all of you, if you don't mind holding your microphones. I think that's just going to work better. We do have a couple hundred people on the live stream, and it's going to work out better that way. So, I mean, I want to start off, and maybe I'll ask you, Linda, you know a thing or two about these issues, not just from your time now in the City Council, but obviously from running a human services organization yourself. But I think it's important first to say that the city has done some really important things. There's been progress just in the last year or so on the Clear the Backlog initiative, on the COLA, the new office that people were talking about. There's been some real progress at the city, but as you heard from this first panel, and there were a lot of things that, and I think, you know, Michelle mentioned, we're not whining here. There's some, I mean, people understand that government may not be as fast or as efficient as the private sector, but there's so many things that rise so far above that to levels that are so maddening, time-consuming, and difficult to navigate for these nonprofits that have a real cost in terms of, dedicating so much staff time and money to filling out paperwork. And so I guess I'm asking you, while the city has made some real progress in supporting nonprofits, how can the council, and I want to ask you, Council Member Juan, as well, how can the council kind of take steps to move things forward and make sure the agencies, because not all of this is up for kind of council responsibilities, but how can you make sure that you push this forward?
No, so it's funny because I actually feel like I should have been on the last panel because that's really where my heart is with my colleagues. So for those that don't know, I was, in the nonprofit sector for the last 20 years, and for the last 12 years, I was running KCS, Korean Community Services, which has a lot of city, state, federal contracts. And so everything you guys are talking about, I'm like, yes, I'm also doing the nodding and, breaking my neck over it. And it's interesting because even on the campaign trail, I would talk to voters at the doors about contracting, and my campaign staff were like, stop talking about it. I'm like, no, this is an important issue. Everyone needs to know about the contracting procurement issues and how it impacts their daily lives. Because I think oftentimes it's like the not sexy side of the real issues that we're seeing on the city and also the nonprofit sector. So I'll start by saying that I have a lot of notes that I took even beforehand of some of the thoughts that I had regarding some of these questions and just being in the sector in the past. Because I think of it also in terms of what are some low-hanging fruit, sort of immediate things we can address versus midterm and long-term goals. And I do think that the training aspect is one thing that I experienced a lot because when I was, at KCS, we would, and it really depends on who your contract officer is or at different agencies or who your ACO is. But I remember, since Maria said it already, DYCD, I'll say it because I wasn't going to name the specific agency. But, it's like they have their own separate requirements. And then, so why am I double doing the work for Passport as well? And I'm like, isn't Passport supposed to alleviate all of this double duty work? And that was the purpose of it. So, and I was around, for the Nonprofit Resiliency Committee where we first started this whole idea of increasing indirect costs as well as, re-looking and thinking through the procurement process. But I think one of the thoughts I had was, and this is going to take a little bit more of a heavy lift, but, for college, right, there's something called like a Common App, right? Where you have one application that you submit to multiple different schools, right? And so for me, I'm like thinking through, yes, I understand there's HIPAA for DOH-MH contracts, there's other certain hindrances depending on what agencies, but what are like the broadest scope of common documents that we can all pull together that we don't have to keep repeating? And really it comes down to perhaps the budgeting and scope aspect of the contract that we would just have to shift and change. And also, my friend who was previously the director of MOX back in the previous administration, when this whole Passport got launched, one of the things that he was trying to look into is a lot of the regulations and legislation that we have to follow, that I say we still, sorry, and that the city agencies have to follow are from these really old school laws that are not necessarily relevant anymore. So in terms of a long-term aspect, like there should be, maybe it's MOX, maybe it's a different city agency, but I think the administration needs to review, because I think as council, what we could do is put legislation out there that would try to hold agencies accountable, right? But that's not getting at the root of the issue, which is we're sort of like adding layer upon layer of legislation. But I think we need to kind of take a step back and relook at a lot of the policies that were put in place originally, why they were there, is it relevant, and maybe there are certain things we could get rid of.
Great. And Councilmember Juan, let me ask you the same question. Now, you are the chair of the Contracts Committee, and I'm curious, maybe same question as Councilmember Lee, but also just how are you going to hold government accountable to make progress on some of these difficult burdens?
Good morning. My name is Julie Wan. I'm the local council member for Western Queens, so we've made it all the way out. I just want to shout out how every single person on this panel is a woman. And there's a lot of power in that. So it's so good to be here. I think first and foremost, contracts is a very dense issue. All of you sitting in this room, we're not normal people. You would not be spending your morning talking about contracts or the procurement process. We're a very specific kind of human beings in the city, and I feel very welcomed here. Because usually when I start talking about procurement, I see like people's eyes starting to glaze over, like they want to be somewhere else. But I know that for us, we are in a very special moment. I know that every one of us are starting to feel it, but this is the first time in a very long time where we have the governor, we have the comptroller, we have the mayor, we have MOCs, and we have the city council sitting in a single room together to talk about procurement reform. That has not been the case before, where we've had traditionally, especially on the city level, the comptroller and the mayor at odds with each other on any issue at hand, pointing fingers at each other. And yes, that is important for oversight, but that is not productive for long-term progress. So all of us sitting on this panel is an example of that, and that is how we have cleared the backlog, as we just heard, for billions of dollars for nonprofits only in the last fiscal year. And I know that many of us are continuing the work. We've already, before I even took the term, the mayor's office, as well as the comptroller's office, and myself from the council have been meeting as a task force for nonprofits and human service providers to really try to figure out what are the tangibles, what are the high-hanging fruits, what are the low-hanging fruits, what are the moderates, and we were able to prioritize which ones we want to get through, and we are still working through a lot of the things that we had planned. And I know that also we have talked about, we have already had meetings on the council side for discretionary budget for the council, comptroller, and OMB, as well as MOCs, to really figure out what we're going to do for the discretionary side, because it simply does not make sense. As someone who was a federal contractor myself and city level contractor when I worked in tech for the last 10 years, as well as someone who was on the board of a founding nonprofit that was just getting established, as well as established nonprofits as well, it is incredibly painful to see nonprofits on the ground in my district, like Community Capacity Development, that does crisis management work, which are employing mostly Black and brown people of low income from the very niches that we're trying to help, go without payroll because they are simply not getting paid on time. And that is not okay. Yet we have a heavy burden for those very nonprofits to carry out the work that the government simply does not have the capacity to do. And we know very well how important it is to get them paid on time, and that is why we have already started taking steps to say, okay, for discretionary funding, when you're getting a lot of $10,000, it is not okay to have a nonprofit the size of 30 employees, having 2 employees dedicated to it for X amount of weeks, because they simply do not have the capacity, and we have created such an administrative burden on those individuals to get $10,000. That is not even enough to pay for their payroll. So we are looking on the council side in partnership. This is the most important part, that we are now in partnership with MOCs and the mayor to make the mayor's office and the comptroller's office to make sure that we're truly reforming where we can make sure that something as easy as discretionary funding is being allotted on time. And I just also want to point out the importance of the governor's office being here, because a lot of the contracts laws that we have to follow as a city is under state jurisdiction, and that is where we really need to see real reform.
Thank you. I want to get to OK and Fran in just a second, but I want to ask our council members just one more follow-up, and that is one of the things that we kept hearing again and again in the first panel, and also has come up in our research, is that, you know, as much as the city is making progress, and even as there's some great things like the passport system, which has been an incredible advance, it's oftentimes there's like 1 or 2 agencies that are kind of like an outlier, like that, or staff at a particular agency that just aren't doing things. And you know, Ben and others on the first panel talked about the need for training, but I'm also curious from an accountability standpoint. You know, like, is there a role that you all see for the council to kind of make sure that some of those straggler agencies kind of get on board, you know, and do some of the things that the other agencies are already doing pretty well? And any thoughts, like how do you hold an individual agency or some of the agencies that, you know, seem to come up? I mean, DYCD came up a bunch of times in this first panel. Yeah. DFTA came up once or twice. We know these agencies are doing really important work, but in terms of the kind of ease of navigation for nonprofits, there seems like there's some agencies that are behind. And what can the council do around those things?
as the contracts chair, I have 3 hearings this month. So if you follow along, usually each committee has 1 hearing per month. That's per usual. But for us, because we have so many contracting issues, I have a DYCD and DFTA co-hearing for contracts this month, as well as a NYCHA and contracts hearing this month. And I have one more, I can't even remember which one it was off the top of my head, but that's how much of a backlog there is, and there is so much hunger. I didn't know that as contracts chair, I would be so popular that everyone would be calling me every month. They're like, come on, please, squeeze me in, let's have another hearing. I'm like, I already have 2. And they're like, come on, squeeze in 1 more. And my general counsel for contracts is like, oh my gosh, Julie, we're too busy. But that just goes to say how many issues we have. But again, that's why it's so important for us to be in partnership with the mayor's office, because it is not possible. At the end of the day, as a committee chair, I have oversight on existing contracts. But it is not enough to just have oversight on the existing contracts, but I need to have the mayor's authority over the agency to say, so that we could call deputy mayor, right, or deputy whoever, and say, hey, this is what we're hearing from the nonprofits, and we need this resolved this month. We cannot wait another year to have a backlog cleared, but we need it resolved this month, because this is people's payroll, and these are the very people you're saying that you're trying to help, and you're preventing it from happening. And then you're gonna see the news where we have issues with homelessness. You're gonna see the news where we have more crime, where we say there are issues with mental health. So we need you to take action now, and thankfully, so far, we have been having that partnership. But overall, I think when it comes to accountability, when we have quasi-city state agencies like DOE who don't want to follow along, and they have more loopholes where they're able to get through without following the protocols, there are issues. And coming from the tech side, what I see first and foremost that I spoke to Lisa Flores and the MOX team about is how there has not been centralization or unified taxonomy on how we classify contracts, or how we determine where the contract should sit, or how we are centralizing all of this data or the contracts that come in instead of having it siloed by agency, by agency, by agency. And that is not productive for oversight at all, because then you're chasing around all of these contracts from all of these agencies, and everyone can punt the ball back and forth, and it is just not productive. And that's what we're trying to work towards with a digital platform like Passport, but we have a long way to go. It is something to applaud that we have gone from a paper-based system that was in person to digital, but we're still not, even the Passport itself that we're currently on for Vandex, that is an out-of-the-box solution that we are not even at the most up-to-date iteration of. We're still outdated. And when you log on, even if you are someone who is very tech savvy, it is not intuitive at all. Not to mention when Lisa explained all of the pain points that she was hearing from the surveys and the customer service, it was very clear to me we were not having issues with the platform itself, but we have an understanding gap with the user, which tend to be smaller nonprofits, or with folks who are coming from the nonprofit side who may not fully know all of the procurement vocabulary or the city's procurement process, which is not something that is easy to learn overnight. So the knowledge gap, it's hard for me to say it's Passport's, all the issues don't fall on Passport, but it's also the understanding gap that we have to close to make sure that every single applicant fully understands the RFP process and what happens in between until you get awarded, so that everyone can navigate it smoothly, along with all of the technology updates that we have to have, like the status bar where you know what you're missing, that is still not clickable, that is not intuitive, there's no language access, it's only in English. So there are a lot of things that we have to work on as a system as a whole, but I want to make sure that we focus on one. We have to make sure that we focus on agencies like DYCD or DOE that are quasi-state or have other loopholes, and make sure that we are using the power of the city council in partnership with the mayor. We have to be on the same side holding these people accountable, and we have to start to centralize where all the contracts sit instead of having them in silos, because that also increases the burden for oversight for the city.
Great.
No, so just to really quickly add to that, I totally agree. I think we need to keep different agencies as well as the mayor's office accountable. OMB has to be at the table too, and I know that oftentimes, so my sort of joke I don't know if I should say this because it's being live streamed, but with OMB is I like to call them the Wizard of Oz, because I'm like, I know there's someone behind the curtain that's pulling all the levers. And it's usually OMB that is, because they're risk averse, right? Their job is to make sure that no city dollar gets spent in a inappropriate way, right? So I get that. But at the same time, the question I always ask, having been in this before, is yes, there's a way to be accountable, I think. I remain cautiously optimistic so far, but I do believe there's a way to be accountable without having it to be so burdensome. There have been a lot of ideas coming from the nonprofit sector, a lot of which you've heard in the previous panel, but for a $5,000 discretionary contract, is the auditing process and contracting procurement process, should it be the same versus like a $100,000 contract, And is there a less burden? And the whole point of this is that we're supposed to be encouraging a lot of these smaller groups to provide services. And as KCS, when I was there, we had a more smaller Korean nonprofit where the staff weren't, English is not their first language, and they came to us and said, can you help us with this contract and helping us to figure out the documentation? So we were like, okay, we'll help you do it. And then they kept asking us every year, and at one point I had to stop and be like, this is a strain on our staff now too, in terms of their time and effort and energy. So how do we uplift a lot of these smaller groups that are trying to get into the contracting process? So there definitely needs to be accountability, but I think it's the mayor's office, it's the city council for sure, and the city agencies. And on the city agency side, I actually had a conversation recently with the commissioner of DDC, because one thing that hasn't been mentioned is the capital project process, which is a whole nightmare, yes, whole nightmare in and of itself, right? And I gotta say, I can tell you stories about our capital process as well. But I actually spoke to the commissioner of DDC because we got a hotshot vehicle through them one time, and the process was crazy. So by the time we actually got the vehicle, the cost had increased. So the money that we were awarded was not enough to cover the cost of the vehicle, right? So I had a conversation recently with the new commissioner of DDC, and he was super enthusiastic about wanting to talk about contracts because, and I said, yeah, I'd be curious to sit down and hear from your perspective as a commissioner of a city agency what your challenges are in this whole conversation as well, because they have their own set of rules and compliance issues that they're facing as well. So again, I think it comes back to us looking and reevaluating all the systems that are in place and whether or not it does make sense, because from small contracts to large, we have to make sure that if the city contracts are, and I hate to say this too, because it's being live streamed, but I find that people respond to bad press, which is not, I don't know if that's a tactic or strategy, but I think we have to hold city agencies accountable, because I thought about this a lot with our capital process, right? We want to be responsible with the dollars, but when you look at the delays and how much increase in actual cost staff time, and if you look at the unforeseen costs and all of that we are actually wasting, I would say, more taxpayer dollars, right? So if there's a study, Jonathan, that can be done, which I think you have done to a degree, that actually shows the dollars that are being wasted because of delayed contracts, right? Versus if we were to actually pay people on time and how much that would actually save the city. I think that's an argument that we have to keep, narrative that we have to keep pushing too.
No, it's a great point. We often think about this, and we've done a lot of work around the nonprofit capital process as well, but it's the same holds true here, where I think so often there's a story in the New York Post about some kind of mismanagement or corruption. It may be for like a $25 million or $5 million, issue, which is not insignificant, but then the fix for that goes so far beyond that it ends up costing hundreds of millions of dollars in extra staff time and all kinds of administrative work. And I think the kind of priorities of it kind of get all out of whack. But so it's a great point. Ilke, I want to bring you in here because obviously Mox has come up quite a few times in this conversation. And would love to hear, your reaction to some of the things on the first panel, but also our panel here is really kind of forward-looking. Where do we go from here? What is the low-hanging fruit? It'd be great to hear a little bit about what is Mox already working on, but also what do you say to the folks that were speaking on the first panel that there's still a lot of issues that need to be addressed and dealt with?
Good morning, everyone. Firstly, to follow up on what Councilmember Wan said about the level of collaboration that we've seen in the last 8 months. I think we've really witnessed an unprecedented level of partnership across the administration and across different leaders. When the administration launched the Clear the Backlog initiative under the leadership of Deputy Mayor Wright and Deputy Mayor Williams-Isom, we collectively saw it as an opportunity and a start to rebuilding a relationship of trust with our nonprofit partners. And I think part of the work of the joint task force that was mentioned during the first panel is really important to mention here. Even before the Backlog initiative was launched, the city had partnered with McKinsey to send out survey and assemble focus groups among the nonprofit community. And a lot of the information that we got from that was used on the city side to assemble working groups that addressed those pain points and shaped tangible recommendations that we can then turn into actionable initiatives. And I think a lot of the initiatives that we're going to be seeing come to light in the short term as well as medium term are going to be leaders and city members across the administration coming together in a room to really discuss these and how to best address them. I think the second recommendation, aside from the overall process reform, was the creation of the Mayor's Office of Nonprofit Services. So moving forward, as those reforms are created and pushed forward, I think the office is going to be critical in addressing, but also amplifying a lot of the needs of the nonprofit sector. I do want to take a side note to discuss Passport, because I think we can all agree that Passport was a huge step towards standardizing disparate business practices. And it was a cultural shift from Release 1 with digitizing disclosures to digitizing contracting. It really allowed us to get to where we are today and have the conversations that we are having today about the role of technology in really innovating this field. With that said, we recognize that digitizing old rules isn't going to be a miracle, and it certainly will require comprehensive reform. We talked about various agency practices. The first panel brought up different agencies, and I think it's fair to say that agencies have different frameworks. They have decades of entrenched institutionalized practices. Some procurement methods and contracts have layers of different regulations and sometimes different funding streams attached to the contracts that make it perhaps not as streamlined and standardized as we want to be. On the MOG side, stakeholder engagement is particularly important for us, and we have over 35,000 organizations in the system. So for us, holding those feedback and those validation sessions, not only with our nonprofit partners, but with our agencies to test out process changes and to test out the enhancements. I think it goes without saying that the Passport of today is not the Passport that you experienced last year. And it's certainly not going to be the Passport that you experience in the years forward. We're constantly reiterating on the system.
Got it. Well, thank you, and obviously, congratulations on the progress so far. I guess I would love to just press you a little bit about kind of, you mentioned the focus groups, the working groups that have been ongoing. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about what's the timetable, when do you expect, can you give us a little hint at a couple of things that maybe they're focused on? Are there some of the issues that came up today among those that you're thinking about? And then secondly, to the point about agencies have some of their own kind of unique, requirements. They do things, they've been doing things this way for a long time. But, some of it is just, it goes so beyond, and there's some things that just seem like such a low-hanging fruit. Some of the things that came up in the first panel about, some agencies requiring in-person, mail actual paper copies. And, there's got to be some of this that could be addressed, but how does City Hall or MOX push for those relatively what seemingly minor changes? And anyway, that's a lot to give to you, but if you don't mind that, just love to hear a little bit about, I guess, what's going to come out of this is what I'm saying.
I think what was great about the feedback and the focus groups that were assembled earlier in the year is that everything was on the table, right? And so on the city side, when we assembled to really discuss those recommendations, likewise, everything is on the table. And we recognize that there are decades of bureaucracy that we need to dig through to identify where we can most acutely address those pain points. So from things as seemingly smaller in scope as streamlining the different document requests so that nonprofits don't have to supply the same documentation to agencies multiple times, to things that are more ambitious, like reforming the discretionary award process. The working groups tackled all of those, and I think on the city side we can all agree that we want to implement these reforms as soon as possible. The backlog, clearing the backlog initiative, $4.2 billion, impacting over 460 nonprofit organizations. It was quite impactful when you think about the scale, and it was all done in 12 weeks. So I think that shows our shared sense of urgency. There are going to be laws and regulations that are not going to be changed overnight. But at the same time, what we can do, those low-hanging fruit, I think those are on the table, as well as the bold changes that Mox and our Director Lisa Flores, are collectively dedicated to. I will say, because it was brought up, the $60 million enhancement to the sector, that is one area where I think, even with an initiative, we wanted to be able to deliver funds in a way that was forward-thinking. We discussed, and one of the pain points that was brought up routinely was the administrative burden that amendments place on nonprofit organizations who contract with the city. And so getting that $60 million in a way that not only met the current urgent critical need, but looked forward in the years ahead. So that $60 million is going to be delivered through a mechanism that we call the allowance clause and allowance amendments. And our nonprofit leaders in the audience hopefully received an email from the city implementation last week announcing that update. And it's very exciting because it's going to prevent a lot of backlog from even originating, and at the same time, really lessen the administrative burdens that organizations and agencies have to deal with processing amendments.
All right. Let me get to Fran because she's been waiting so patiently here. And let me say also that Fran is one of my favorite people in New York. I think I've known you for 29 years, and I'm not sure there's anybody that's been such a champion for the nonprofit sector. Thanks for being here, Fran. And I feel like in the first discussion, the state didn't come up as much as I've heard it come up in some of the research that we've done. Because
it's a lot of work on my part.
From what I gather in researching these issues, a lot of folks have told us that the state's grants gateway system is probably even further behind than a lot of the city processes, and that more work is needed. And so I guess, when you and I were talking recently, you mentioned that the state is just initiating kind of a transition from the grants gateway, and I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about that? But also, how do all of us make sure that in that transition that we use it as an opportunity to make the changes that people still struggle with in this sector?
Okay, well, let me tell you a little bit about, Fred, I watched you struggle with this one, so I wasn't even going to try. What I understand is afoot right now is that DOB, Division of Budget, at the state level is in the process of creating a new sort of upgrade to Grants Gateway. And that Grants Gateway will eventually, over the next, I think, year or so, fade out. And that this new system developed by DOB, which will be under, I'd say the words that are used are SFS, the state financial system, that this new system will operate within the state financial system. The system, this is very, very recent. We've only begun talking to DOB, I guess, in the last few months about this. So, but we do expect that, fond as you all are of Grants Gateway, there will be some changes that will sort of, under everybody's watchful eye and DOB's intention, I think that things will get a little smoother. But as I say, it's not, it's nowhere near done. It's just beginning. One of the questions that I get compared to the very rigorous input that the nonprofit sector had in the city's process and discussion is, where will the nonprofit sector fit into the state's discussion? At the moment, I don't know that yet, and I would invite you, if you have questions about this, and I'm sure you will, just write to me and I will tell you what I know at the point at which I know it. But it's a very beginning process. The upstate nonprofit networks are less vocal. You have to go seek them out to see what they think about, about particular issues, et cetera. But this reform, I think, is going to be very important, and I think that DOB does want to see this same system used across all agencies. Right now with Grants Gateway, as many of you are aware, some people opt in and some people do not. Some agencies opt in for one RFP or another, but not everything they do. So I think what we're going to see at the end of this process is a more uniform approach to contracting throughout the state. And we have been welcome at the city's meetings. They've been helping us they've been explaining the way they went about things and how they did things. And I will say that the Hochul administration is very encouraging about interaction between the city and the state. And so we have an open conversation with the Mayor's Office of Contract as well. There is a nonprofit input system called the Nonprofit Contracting Committee, which I know probably none of you have ever heard of, but it does exist in law, was created under Mario Cuomo, does support meetings every 4 years on contract, every 4 times a year, I'm sorry, every 4 years wouldn't be too good, 4 times a year. And they are, in those meetings, another one, the next one coming up September 13th. Those meetings are, at least for the moment, available, on Zoom or whatever this wondrous world is that we live in, where things come on your screen, and also in person. And there we will hear from various agencies all the time about what those what those agencies are thinking about, what they're working on, that kind of thing. And so I expect that this new contract reform will be much discussed at the Nonprofit Contracting Committee. And I do invite all of you to, get in touch with us or activate through that committee, because that will be the center of this conversation. DOB will be reporting there at every meeting. So I don't know, does that answer half of your questions?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. All right.
I guess we don't have too much time left, and so I'd like to give everybody a chance to talk in a minute or less, if you don't mind. Just like, what do you see as the priorities for government? What do you want to see changed? I mean, there's a lot of these issues. Some of them are complex and require huge structural fixes. Some of them are more low-hanging fruit. And obviously, as I said before, there's already been some great progress, but yet the sector still has these really maddening challenges that does seem like we should be able to do something about. And so I guess for all of you, and maybe Fran, we'll start and go backwards, but just like, what's one thing that you'd like to see for sure going forward?
I'd like to see more communication between upstate and downstate for sure. I'd definitely like to hear more from the upstate organizations, and I'd like to see the downstate organizations interacting with the upstate organizations, which is beginning to happen in small pockets. One of the things that we just were able to do was publish a website for the nonprofits in New York State. And it speaks only to nonprofit issues. And we will have on that website latest, information, et cetera, from various agencies, et cetera, and also updates on the contracting reforms. But one of the things that I think for me is, I've lived on both sides of this world now, and I feel like the agency staff are not really factored into the conversations that we're having. And if the workers don't buy into what we're trying to do, then they just go about and do the same thing they've been doing for the last 20 years, which is move this paper from here to there, and then you move the next paper, because that's their job. But if they understood that it means whether or not people eat, if they were able to be able to allow to go visit and see what it means to see a great youth program or a great, music, entertainment, arts program. We have a great arts program at the state, incidentally. But, those are I think we need to factor in all of the stakeholders, and that the workers who work for city and state, as well as the workers who work for the nonprofits, need to find ways to at least see each other, not as problems, but as solutions. You want to just pass it down?
Yes.
Oh.
No, I think you touched upon it really well. And to the gentleman's point in the middle that asked the question on the last panel, I think that's exactly the point that you're bringing up, is that sometimes the folks that are at the agencies don't always understand the impact that they have as the approvers of a lot of these contracts. So I think that training and overarching big picture is important to have on the agency side. But when I think of it, I think of a few key words: efficiency. We want to make it efficient for the nonprofit organizations. I don't know. For me personally, I've always wondered, do we need to submit the certificate of no change that many times? And is something that small of a requirement, if we don't submit it, going to penalize us from getting our contracts through? And I just wonder and question those types of things where something as small as a one-pager for a certificate of no change, to me, that always boggled my mind. So things like that, which is reevaluating efficiency on the nonprofit end. I think accountability is very important, but at the same time, I think it's always one-sided, right? We as nonprofit, I say we all the time, sorry, because I still feel, as nonprofit agencies are always being asked to, submit this document, submit this, submit that, and you got to hold on to your paper documents for 7 years minimum, right? And that takes up space. But we need to talk about accountability on the agency side, because I know that even I left KCS in 2021 of December, right before I started this, and at that time we still didn't have some of our contracts registered, but the previous ones ended. So we literally were operating and paying staff and expenses with no contract in place, and to me that's criminal, in my opinion. That's just me. But I think that needs to be, we need to find a mechanism, a way to hold city agencies accountable, and to make sure that they're also holding their end of the bargain, which is that they need to be paying us, which is sort of like this overarching. And then my last sort of word that comes to mind is the communication aspect, is that everything is very siloed, right? So how do we partner? I think the task force was a great start, but that should be ongoing continuously. And those recommendations should be, constantly heard on the administration side. And so how do we make sure that the communication is there between the city agencies themselves, right? Because I don't think sometimes the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, because they have their own requirements and they're very siloed. But then also the city agencies, how does that connect with what we do as a city council, as well as the mayor's office and OMB, right? Because I think, again, OMB needs to be part of this conversation, and we need to draw them into the conversation, in my opinion, because I get the theory of why they should be so behind the scenes, but in all honesty, they control so much of what gets approved and doesn't, that I think they need to be part of this conversation with us at the table constantly. So, communication, efficiency, accountability, those are all important things, but yeah.
Thank you.
To follow up on Councilmember Lee's point about risk, I think COVID proved that the city has an outdated approach to risk, and rules or procedures that may have come into place 15 years ago, not to create bureaucracy, but to address real issues that happened at that time, may not necessarily be relevant today. And I think the reform work is going to be focusing on those, again, digging into the bureaucracy to see which of those perhaps are no longer necessary as we move forward, especially our nonprofit partners proving during COVID with services, and a lot of the expediting that was facilitated during that time, I think showed that it is possible. The second point that I think is a priority, beyond streamlining, of course, is getting contracts registered on time. I mean, right now we're taking the lessons learned from the Backlog initiative to make sure that, one, backlog is never created again, and two, how do we make expediting the normal course of business? How do we take the collaboration as well as the high-level policy alignment that happened during that time and continue it and push it forward in the years to come? So I think the Office of Nonprofit Services will be really building on some of the groundwork that was laid out by the Nonprofit Resiliency Committee to bring the nonprofit sector and our leaders together on a regular basis and act as a forum for discussing policy initiatives, as well as be a method of collaborating on future outcomes. And just to add, I am a researcher by background. Every day I do all my work with data. And so I think for the city, in terms of moving forward with capacity, being able to leverage data in a way that really informs our policy decisions and efficiencies.
I just wanted to step in really quickly and follow up on one thing that Ilke mentioned about the getting things off the books that may no longer be needed in terms of the requirements or regulations. And this is just an observation as kind of an outside perspective, but years ago, must have been 15 years ago now, I remember the city council did this really interesting initiative. We've written a lot about small businesses. And this one time, the council decided, hey, we as a council are often putting new regulations on small businesses to do X or Y. We should kind of go through and review all the regulations and see if there's 10 or so that maybe one year we can say, hey, these are no longer needed. And it seems like the same kind of thing ought to be done, whether it's the council or the administration, but to see hey, are there 10 things on the books for these requirements for contracting that may be no longer needed? But there needs to be a process, it seems like, to go through all that. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt, Councilmember One. You have the last word.
No worries. For what I want to see is threefold. That's someone who's also data-driven and numbers-driven. I want to see, first and foremost, timeframes established for every single process, for the procurement process as well as contracting process. We have to have set timeframes. This is how you prevent delays. Secondly, I also want to see published KPIs for key performance indicators for every single agency, because that is how we keep the agencies accountable. And thirdly, I want to make sure that the current status tracker that we have for our nonprofit and vendor partners are built out and developed so that it truly is like a pizza tracker where you know from the moment you submit your order till the moment it gets delivered, we know exactly where it is. And if there is some sort of issue or a block, that we are able to address it immediately. So you can always count on me as a contracts chair. Feel free to email me. My email is very easy to remember, jwonj1@council.nyc.gov. If there is an issue that you're having with an existing contract, or if there is an issue that is overall an issue with an agency that you want to see in an oversight hearing, please feel free to reach out, because I'd love to have a conversation with you, as well as hold the agencies accountable and the admin. So I look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
All right. Hey, could I get a hand for this wonderful panel? Now, Yes, thank you. That was really great. Michelle Jackson's going to come out. We're going to just do very quick kind of next steps here. But before you say anything, Michelle, I just want to thank our members of government for all the really good work. As I mentioned a couple of times, there's been some real progress, and I think that it's worth really recognizing that there's good work being done. So thank you. I also want to thank the nonprofits that are here today and that are watching on the live stream for just the important work that you do for our city. Thank you.
So I also want to just extend thank yous. I think it's always important for us to leave with like next steps and hopefully some actionable items so that you don't feel like you spent your morning just complaining and nothing's getting done. So, but first I do want to say I didn't get to introduce Councilmember Julie Wan at the beginning of the panel, so I wanted to make sure I did that. She's also my council member. So I wanted to make sure I introduced her. I think I've been doing this for a long time. I've been at HSC for 16 years, and not much on my list has changed in terms of like the procurement issues. And also as an advocate, I have to be eternally optimistic, or I wouldn't do this work. If you don't think things can change, like what are we doing? And I really do feel a renewed sense of energy at both the city and state. The change in administration. We have amazing partner in Mox. We have amazing champions in the city council, people who come from the sector and understand these issues. There's a little procurement caucus among some of the city council, which is like new, and they really understand these issues. And we've already seen a dramatic amount of changes in both the number of hearings that have focused on contracting, in how the city council talked about nonprofits and understanding our issues, and also for Mox. OMB, the deputy mayors have been real champions. They come from the sector. And I've been really, I felt very renewed in working with the new administration on these issues. The Clear the Backlog initiative, yes, there's still a ways to go, but the amount of work that they accomplished in 12 weeks and really cleaning up someone else's mess, which is not exactly what you want to be doing. And then also at the state, Fran has been a tireless champion for the nonprofit sector. And now she has new help in people like Catherine Garcia, who are also really committed to operations issues. I have gone to the nonprofit advisory group. We send out the notice. I think Fred Jack and I have gone tirelessly for many years to Albany, and also, and so we're happy to see that work with DOB that you'll be doing. The Office of Nonprofit Services, as Maria mentioned, holds a lot of promise, and it's something we will be following really closely. And while we have a lot of work to do, HSC has a procurement agenda that we're very excited to partner with CUF on in terms of like what are the next steps, like how do we make this list actionable? And so you'll see a lot from us in the coming months in partnership with government. There's so many things that we can do, so we might as well come together and check off things through the Office of Nonprofit Services, through the state group, and we'll certainly be working on making sure the full backlog is cleared. I think the allowance clause is also a huge key thing as a nonprofit, in terms of kind of. So we've seen the right steps, right? 8 months into the administration, a year and change into a new governor. And so we're at HSC are really committed to rebuilding our procurement agenda with new administration who are really committed to this in mind. And you'll be seeing a lot more from us. And I also want to thank our government panelists, my nonprofit panelists, and also CUF for being great hosts for us today.
And I just have a quick last word. To Ponce Bank, thank you again for your generous support, for making today's event possible. To Stephanie and all of the staff at CUF. We are a nonprofit and we have amazing staff, so thank you to the Center for Our Future staff. And lastly, Michelle kind of alluded to this, but my research team has been working on a policy brief focused on exactly these issues, the administrative burdens facing human services nonprofits. We are going to be highlighting a handful of the most egregious and outrageous and maddening burdens and trying to put it in a simple terms. And so if you we talked to 30 or 40 folks over the last couple of months, but if you have stories or examples or anecdotes that you'd like us to include in this report, don't hesitate to reach out to me, jbowles@nycfuture.org. We'd love to hear from you, but do stay tuned for that report. It's going to be out in the next couple of months. But thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to our panelists, and have a great day.